I'm fantasy author Elle Penelope, and welcome to My Imaginary Friends, a look behind the scenes of an author mapping the worlds in my head and making them a reality. Hello friends, today is Friday, August 16th, 2019, and this is episode 28 of My Imaginary Friends. I'm Leslie. I am feeling a little subdued today because I am sick. Why am I sick, you might ask? Well, I saw my 3-year-old niece over the weekend, and as we know, every time we see the niece, we get sick. She's my husband's brother's daughter, and she's quite adorable. Her name is Finley, but she is a bastion of disease, I suppose as all children are. And I've only seen her once in the past year and not gotten sick afterwards, so when I'm on deadline, I have a moratorium on visits to Finley because it becomes very difficult to accomplish anything when you're sick. So yes, blame Finley is the moral of the story. And if you think it's unfair to blame a 3-year-old, well, then life is unfair. She should learn that now. Anyway, this week's best thing. I have had an earworm stuck in my ear all week, and that is why this week's best thing is the song Giovanni by Jamila Woods. It is a song that is based on Nikki Giovanni's poem Ego Trippin', which is one of my favorite poems. Nikki Giovanni is one of my favorite poets, along with Edgar Allan Poe, Sylvia Plath, and Langston Hughes. I have an eclectic variety of poetry that I enjoy. Dorothy Parker's poetry is also very cool to me. But I've had this book, the Ego Trippin' book, which I guess the poem came from. And when I started, I first heard of Jamila Woods. My brother sent me a text a few months ago, and I hadn't heard of her before. I do listen to Spotify, like the top 50 charts, to try to stay in touch with what the young people are listening to, because otherwise, I don't listen to the radio anymore. And I wouldn't know. But I guess she's a little bit more niche than that. And so he texted me, he's like, I think you'd like her, and I did. A lot of times my brother and I taste in music does not align, but in this instance it did. And so I listened to her album before, and then I'm going to be doing this blog tour in a few weeks. And so the bloggers asked, one of the questions was a playlist for the Earthsinger Chronicles. And so I was going through, because I don't write to music, and so most of the time, like there are certain books, more the contemporary books, sometimes I'll write to music, but not the historicals. So I was looking through the music and just trying to find some songs that represented the spirit and the energy and the emotions of the books, and I was definitely going to include Black Girl Soldier by Jamila Woods, a different song, because the lyrics something about black girl magic. But then I was just listening to a bunch of stuff, and I was listening to the song, and then I'm a kind of person who I can listen to the same song over and over for hours. Like if I like a song and if I'm in that mood, I will put it on single song repeat and just listen to it. And so I did that. And I also like to know the lyrics. So it's wonderful that in this day and age, you can just go to genius.com and get the lyrics to any song. Now, they aren't going to always be 100% correct, but I found that if I look at a few different lyric sites and see the differences, and then listen to the song myself, I can figure out the actual words. So even on this song, at this point in time, there are, and I don't think she changes the words, but they have different versions of the same for the chorus. Anyway, I wanted to look at the words, and so I was listening to it over and over and over again and looking at the lyrics and trying to memorize them, which is another thing that I do. And it's in my head right now, actually. It's a really great song. And also, as I was writing this week and listening to the song, it gave me some ideas about how to solve some problems in my manuscript. I'm working on book 4 of the Earthsinger Chronicles, and my outline is there. Been working on it, writing scenes and outlining, but there's still things like I know these things have to happen, but I don't know how they happen. And so just listening to the song gave me an idea, like the kernel of an idea for something that could fix a problem that I know is in my future. Like it's It's coming up quickly, actually. Like I have to write it probably in the next couple of weeks. So that was also really good. It was just inspiring, great song, stuck in my head. I will link to it so it can be stuck in your head too. And so since the lyrics are based on the Ego Trippin' poem, but she doesn't use any of those words, it really is done really well. Like I really love how she approached it. The fact that this poem was the inspiration, and that comes through without being a copy of it. And so it had me going back to reading the original poem, which I had memorized a long time ago. And but I haven't read it in years. And so I was reading it, and just as I was reading, I was like, I know the words. I can just stop reading and recite them. Because it is a really powerful poem. And the book that I don't have a lot of books from my childhood. I've moved across the country a couple of times, and only a few books made it. And so vaguely I remembered having a book that was autographed by Nikki Giovanni, and I was like, is Ego Tripping in that book? And I opened it up, and it's not autographed by her, but it's autographed by my dad. And my dad gave me that book. It's autographed to me and my brother Paul, and the date was 1988, so I was 10 years old. And my father passed away 15 years ago, and so just looking at his handwriting, I got really emotional, and getting emotional now talking about it. But yeah, so it was just kind of a chain of creative and emotional things that were inspired by that song. And I on Genius.com, looking at the lyrics to that song, it links to a video of Nikki Giovanni reading from an essay or a book of essays that she had, which was full of like really great quotes also. When I was at ALA a few weeks ago, in June, I think, I walked by Nikki Giovanni, and she was just like walking down the hall talking to somebody, and I was right next to her, and I stopped and I looked at her, and I was like, should I say something? I could just fangirl all over her, and that would be not fun for her, I'm sure. So I did not have the courage to speak to Nikki Giovanni at that point in time. And also I was going to my signing. My excuse was I didn't have time because I was going to my own signing, but it was really just, I was not scared, but because when you do tell people the impact that they've had, I feel like most people take that with grace. But I also understand that sometimes people are just living their life and walking down the hall and don't want to be bothered by their fans. And I do try to think of that when I meet celebrities. I've had the chance, like, being with my brother and being on set with him, meeting celebrities and knowing. And I've actually been with my brother when he's been recognized by fans, because he was on a show that was very popular among a certain demographic. And even, he will get recognized still from it. And so, it's like, he doesn't mind necessarily. Like if we're at dinner or something and like he's about to eat, he'll be like, oh, well, can you wait till I finish eating and then I'll sign your autograph or whatever. Which I think is perfectly reasonable. Most people should understand that. But I don't know. It's like that. I don't want to bother people. I'm conscious of their privacy, but, and I would also just like to meet them, but just walking by her was enough. Anyway, there was a quote, of course I wrote it down in a text file. Oh, yeah. So at the end of her reading this passage from this, and I don't know, I'll link to what the actual book or essay was. There were two quotes that I wrote down. The first is, men grow beards to protect the throat, have hair on their chests to protect the heart, have afros to cushion the head blows. And that, like, yeah, it kind of blew my mind a little bit. Because I think it was talking about, like, black men and the relationship that black women and black men have. And at the very end, her last line was, I really like to think a black, beautiful, loving world is possible. I really do, I think. So that, combined with rereading Ego Tripping and sparking this idea for this story, for how to connect some threads in my story, or a way to achieve this thing I'm trying to do, and thinking about the world that I have created. It's a black world, and I wrote a black world that is not a beautiful, loving world, but I'm ending the series and I'm trying to end with hope, but not tied with a bow, you know? And so those are just some things that struck me as I was listening and watching and reading things this week. And they're churning in my mind, you know. Part of the struggle that I had initially when thinking about how to end the series was a lot of the struggle and the conflict is based on forms of prejudice and discrimination and racism. And how do I give that a happily ever after, you know, when there's no precedent for it? And I can't, but I'm committed to having my stories end happily. But ending happily doesn't have to mean I've solved racism in this book, because that's not going to happen. But ending happily for these characters, ending with hope, I think is the more important thing. And I think if you end with hope and try to satisfy the reader, then that will give you that feeling, you know, like romance is the genre of hope. And fantasy, I think, is not always hopeful, but I don't know, I do have an expectation. You know, I do have an expectation of hope and of happiness at the end. At least the fantasy that I like to read. I don't read grimdark, and I'm just not attracted to that. So even if you want that sort of, and I don't want to say realism, but you want that sort of authenticity of every conflict doesn't end in happily ever after, but conflicts do end, and people move on and find spaces and carve out lives and things. So those are just other things that I've been thinking about in terms of bringing this series to a close. So my writing update is that it's been going pretty well. I've gotten about 9,000 words this week so far. I decided my week is going to end on Sundays, so I'll calculate it Monday to Sunday. And I stopped when I realized I have to go back and do some more plotting work before I can write the next scenes, because I've written up until what I know. But what has been working is after I finish a scene, I plan the next scene that I'm going to write. And I've been writing them on note cards. So I had a bunch of note cards with the whole plot, but as I've been reworking things, they were just really sentences, just glimpses of what has to happen in the scene. So before I actually sit down and write it, I really have to visualize what's happening in the scene. And I'm going to using kind of a modified version of the story grid, which it has the 5 commandments of storytelling, and I think I added a couple more. So I have this note card that I will link, and I made little icons for each step, and there are 7 things that I have to know about the scene before I write it. And so the things are the desire of the POV character, what they go into the scene wanting, the inciting incident, the progressive complications, the turning point, the crisis, the climax, and the resolution. And 5 of those are from StoryGrid, and 2 of those are from cobbled together from other things. And that has really been helping me. So I do a card for each scene, and then I sit down and put my timer on, get my office mark, put my Coffeetivity sounds on, and do a writing sprint and write it. And then by the end of it, no matter what I've written, I kind of already know what needs to change. Like, I won't go back and change it because this is still the fast draft, but I will understand, having gone through it, that, oh, wait, I did this, but I really think it should be this. Like, for example, I had one scene taking place on a farm, and this whole plot line was, well, part of it was going to take place on a farm. And that was just the first thing that had come to me. And then I realized, well, it would be a lot more, there would be a lot more conflict if it was in a more interesting environment. And would they go to a farm? And why are they on a farm? So then I decided, like partway through writing the scene, that no, this really takes place in a mountainous, icy winter fortress that they've reclaimed. It's like these ruins of a palace in the mountains, and it's snowing and it's cold and it's, not insulated or anything. And there's a lot more opportunity for conflict and discomfort there, and just conflict with the environment. And this is a very different environment from where this particular character came from. They came from a desert. So I'm not going to go back and rewrite it until the revision, but once I make that decision, I just move on as if it's always been in this icy fortress instead of the first couple of scenes that I wrote that were on the farm. So that is how the writing is still going well. I don't sound super excited about it because I'm very tired and I'm not feeling super great, but it's been good. There was also a podcast, one of the RWA podcasts that I listened to this week that was on productivity. And I'll link to that as well. And the person they were talking to was a life coach, and they talk about writing productivity and the idea of big chunk writers versus small chunk writers. Because a lot of times people were like, how do you fit in your writing? Oh, well, I write on my phone so I can write in line at the grocery store and when I'm dropping my kids off and waiting for them at soccer practice. And I'm always, when I hear people say things like that, I'm like, wow, I can't do that at all. And those are small chunk writers because they can just grab 5 minutes here and there and just get some words in. And I'm a big chunk writer. I need to sit down for at least 25 minutes and walk through the scene and visualize it and write it and not be interrupted. And that's just different styles. And so being a small chunk writer, if you see that advice where, just, have a notebook and scribble in the elevator while you're waiting to go to your floor and stuff, like, that kind of stresses me out. But if it does work for our people. I mean, I know that. And also because my life is set up differently. I don't have to write in these little snatches of time that I grab in between, ferrying children back and forth and at my lunch break at work and stuff. And I'm fortunate in that regard that I can design my day to fit that. So I understand that. But even before, I stopped taking new clients in my business like 3 or 4 years ago, so I could write. And so I work, basically half the day at my business, and I write and do writing stuff the other half of the day. And some days I have to change that percentage depending on what's going on. But that's a choice that I was able to make because I'm self-employed. But when I've been self-employed for completely self-employed for 12 years. And I've run my business for 16 years. So I wasn't really writing this hard when I was working outside my home. But even when I was still taking on new clients and basically just working full time, I was not a small chunk writer, I wasn't grabbing pieces of time. I would write late at night. At that point, I would stay up till 1 and 2 in the morning writing. But I still needed that kind of big chunk of time. So a lot of things is just figuring out what style you are. But I had never heard of that. It described in that way. And it allowed me to understand why when people would say those things, I would be so uncomfortable because the idea of writing on the subway or something, even if I had to commute every day to work, if I had to, then maybe I would make those sorts of changes and be more flexible and figure it out in that way. But somehow I think I would still have to carve out larger pieces of time to write. In reading news, I read Empire of Sand. I don't think I talked about this last week. Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri, which I saw a recommendation on Twitter for it and saying how it was a great fantasy, but that romance readers would really love it. And it hadn't really been marketed towards romance readers, but it was a great romance. And it was fabulous. I loved it. I immediately recommended it to my friends. I was like, this is literally one of the best fantasy romances I've ever read. It was so emotional, and I was so on board, and I was crying all the way through the second half of it, but in the best way. And I really loved it. It's interesting because I recommended it in my newsletter with Death's Dancer by Jasmine Silvera, and they both feature dancing as a part of it. Like in Death's Dancer, she calls it God's dancing, and they're both kind of dancing for sleeping gods as a part of ritual. In Empire of Sand, it's more a cultural thing where, but they're both in very different ways have these main characters who dancing for these deities is a very important part of their lives and the story. And that was really fascinating too. Both really good books. I think I talked about Death's Dancer before though. I also finished A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, which I had mentioned last week, and I ended up getting the audiobook so that I could get through it, which, audiobooks help me with books that I find slow. And I did find this, like, the beginning 60% or so kind of slow. But the last 40% I was totally on board with, and I was like itching to get back to figure out what happened. And I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to read the rest of the series. I went on Goodreads because when I ended, it was fine. Like I said, I got past the slow parts, I got into it, and I really enjoyed the rest of it with some caveats. But the main character is not my favorite. Like some books just aren't for you. And so I'm like, oh gosh, if she's the main character, can I stand her for another few books? So I went on Goodreads to spoil it for myself and to figure out what happened. And now it's like, I am very split down the middle, even more so about whether I want to continue. Part of me really wants to like see how she does this, and part of me is very turned off by the spoilers that I read. And this is a series that is beloved by many, many, many people. It is hugely successful and a favorite of a lot of people. And like I said, I did enjoy it with caveats, but and I don't want to spoil it. But she does some things that I can't get down with. And that's all I'll say about that for the moment. Whenever I feel sort of meh about a book that is just hugely beloved and just like a runaway superstar success, I always wonder, like, what's wrong with me? Like, why don't I love this book like everyone else does? And I don't know. I will say that what Sarah J. Maas is able to do is really, I don't know if I can put it into words because I'm not sure what it is. Like, at the same time as I was very frustrated by this main character, if I continue the series, it won't be for that main character. It will be for Rhys. If you've read the book, I want to know what happens with him. And so she was able to create a secondary character at this point who I'm very invested in, even as I'm not invested in the primary character. So that is very interesting. And even I finished the book like 2 days ago, and it's still on my mind. And that's also a triumph, for a book that I'm still kind of meh on a large part of. But the reason I wanted to finish it was because of what I talked about last week about YA versus adult fantasy, and that book was a good example of something that really was adult fantasy that was getting called YA, and then also getting called out because of the sex scenes. And so the sex scenes, at least in the first book, and I don't know if further in the series they get more explicit, but they were not terribly explicit. Like, anyone calling that smut is obviously not a romance reader in any way. And so the scenes in my book are definitely more described, I'll say. And so if people have a problem with that book being YA, then I think they would also have a problem with any of my books being YA. So, just food for thought, I guess. So yeah. Wheel of Time casting news came out this week, and it's colorblind casting, and I saw someone post about it, and I was like, let the protests begin, because there are a lot of brown faces on that photo of the cast. Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan is the epic fantasy series, if you're not familiar with it. I think it's 14 books. I got to book 7, 6 or 7, I think it was book 7, and just petered out, like at that point he was still alive, and I think they were up to book 9, and then he passed away, and Brandon Sanderson had to finish the series, something that we're all, I don't read Game of Thrones, I haven't read the books, but we as a collective, universe are concerned about George R. R. Martin dying before he finishes that. Maybe Brandon Sanderson will get a chance to finish Game of Thrones too, or A Song of Ice and Fire. But I did really enjoy Wheel of Time while I was reading it. And at this point, there's no way I'm going to go back and start over. It's been at least a decade since I stopped reading it. or so, I don't know what the years are, but it's been a really long time. I mean, it was before I got married, so it had to be at least a decade before since I've read those books. And yeah, I'm not gonna go back, but I will watch the show potentially because of all the brown faces. But I saw it's like a Variety art. Where was it? Whatever article it was, I looked in the comments, and of course, well, Robert Jordan had them described because of, there's certain descriptions in certain countries and people looked a certain way, and now it's going to be very confusing because we don't know who's from what country, blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't pure vitriolic racism, but it was like, they should have cast them the way they were in the books. So of course that's going to start, and people are going to be mad, but, I'm not mad. Bring on your racially blind casting. I think that I'm here for it. Oh, and before I leave, a shout out to Library Addict for recommending agendio.com after I talked about my planners last week. And it is a site where you can design your own planner. So they've got a bunch of different options. You have to be within their options, but it is really flexible, and I went through and I started designing a planner, so I might give that a try. So thank you very much for that recommendation. I'm super excited about that. I really appreciate it, and we'll see how that works out. I think I'm going to start it for the next quarter, so you can order a 6-month one or a 12-month one, so I'll try a 6-month one for the next 2 quarters and see how it works. Still, tweaking the process all the time. So that is it for me for this week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and until next time, happy reading.
For episode show notes and to learn more about me and my books, go to lpenelope.com. Subscribe to My Imaginary Friends wherever you get your podcasts, and check out the video episodes on YouTube. And please leave a rating and review to help support the show.